Marcilly-le-Hayer by M. R. James. Read by Wilbur Friesman Durst. I was travelling a good many years ago in France and found myself at a place called Moulins. I went into a curiosity shop not far off the Hôtel de Ville to inquire the price of a drawing I had noticed in the window. The man asked more than I wanted to give, so I began looking at other things. There were a few old books, all totally uninteresting to me, but as it turned out, there was nothing else in the shop that I cared in the least to acquire, and so, by way of doing something to justify the trouble I had given, I bought 5 or 6 of the smallest of these books. Next day I went by train to Troyes, and when I was tired of looking out of the window, I opened my handbag and took out at random one of my purchases. It was an odd volume of an old novel called Caroline de Lichtenfeld, Madame de Montelieur's, under, as I take it, a nom de plume, the sort of book that is rarely disturbed from any resting place it may have found, by me at any rate. For all I know, it may be a standard work. I began at the beginning and turned over 40-odd pages or so. The story made very little progress. Then my eye was attracted by some building we were passing, and I studied the landscape for 2 or 3 miles. After that, I returned to my book, and noted that I had reached page 43, and was in the middle of a dialogue which ran thus. Où descendez-vous? À l'hôtel des ambassadeurs. Bon, dit-il, vous avez sans doute commandé une chambre? Ah, non, dis-je. Je n'y avais pas même songé, mais cela s'arrangera sans doute. La ville ne serait pas en fête ces jours-ci? Il haussa les épaules. Qui sait? Fit-il. Parlons d'autre chose. Vous la connaissez, je pense, la ville de Troyes. Je n'ai fait que passer par là il y a 10 ans. At this point I turned over the page and at the same time glanced up. My eye fell on my opposite neighbour, who was an elderly lady, stout, and wearing a slight black moustache and a highly determined expression. She was not otherwise interesting. I resumed my reading. The words were curiously appropriate. Vous regardiez votre vis-à-vis, continua-t-il. Eh oui, qu'y a-t-il de singulier en cela? En effet, très peu de choses. Seulement, vous la verrez égorgée ce soir, savez-vous où elle demeure? Monsieur, ne parlez pas de la sorte. Comment donc? Moi, qui la vois pour la première fois. Eh bien, je vous le dirai. C est à Marcilly-le-Hayer, sur la place, la maison à 3 pignons. Vraiment? C est bien possible, mais, pour vous dire vrai, elle ne me paraît pas bien intéressante. A very long-winded dialogue, this, I thought, not much concentration about it. And I turned over a leaf or two to see where we were getting to. I found that the personage who had volunteered the information about the woman in the book was now disgorging more, in fact, was giving her whole biography. She had been a labourer's daughter in the village of Marcilly-le-Hayer. Her good looks had attracted the notice of a middle-aged man who owned a good deal of property in the place, a Monsieur Émile Giraud, a name which to me seemed unaccountably familiar. He was, said the book, a thoroughly reputable, honest, and amiable person, and his love for the girl Eugénie Dupont was sincere. The match was, of course, an extremely advantageous one for her. She had no lover of her own rank whom she was in the least inclined to favour, and the marriage took place. After nearly 3 years of what seemed to all their acquaintances a very happy married life, Monsieur Giraud disappeared from Marcilly, leaving absolutely no trace. He used to leave a not inconsiderable sum of ready money in the house towards the end of each week to pay his men. It was on a Friday that he was found to be missing, and the money was gone too. The widow was obliged to procure a further supply from the branch of the Société Générale in the village. She felt the loss of her husband acutely and never married again. Société Générale, I said to myself, I did not think that existed in the 18th century. But, said the book, in continuation, if anyone were to go to Marcilly-le-Hayer and call at the house with the three gables, and ask to see the mistress, and ask her what she keeps under the pavement in the further corner of the stable, he would then find out whether she was interesting or not. It would be a very impertinent question to ask anyone, I thought, and with that I put the book away and took another. The train to Troyes was very full, and I realized, to my disgust, before my journey was over, that a large cattle show was going on there. I had very great difficulty in finding any room at all. At last I was accommodated with a bed in a rather second-rate establishment called the Hotel Terminus. The only part of this place which had any pretension to novelty was the name which was palimpsested over the door. I amused myself by deciphering the old sign, still partly visible underneath. It read, Hôtel des Ambassadeurs. After exploring Troyes, I found I had a day or two to spare, and I studied the map of the department. There I found, as you might find, the name of Marcilly-le-Hayer, occupying a very prominent place in the midst of the uplands which no railway touches. I believe that I had forgotten all about the story in my book in the days which had passed since I read it. But I now recollected it, and this, combined with the fact that there seemed to be some interesting buildings in and near Marcilly, determined me to go there. I bicycled thither a laborious ride and arrived late in the afternoon. There was an inn on the Place which was quite satisfactory, and I had, of course, come prepared to spend a night there. Immediately opposite to the window of my room was a house with three gables. In the evening I had some talk with the people of the house and asked if there were any interesting features in the town. I was told of a very fine carved chimney-piece chez Madame Giraud. And where did she live? I naturally asked. We were at the door of the inn. Straight opposite, said my informants, pointing to the house with the three gables. I pondered and pondered, but no light came. The persistence of names in a place like Marcilly must be a marked feature. One other question was inevitable. What, I asked, was Madame Giraud's maiden name? Dupont, monsieur, Eugénie Dupont. When I got back to my luggage at Troyes, I looked again at the volume of Caroline de Lichtenfeld. It was a defective copy. Pages 33 to 80 were absent, had evidently never been bound up in it. On the fly-leaf, in a feminine hand, was the name Émile Giraud. I did not sleep much that night at the Terminus. The day's ride to Marcilly and back, for I had returned by a roundabout route along chalky lanes, retracing my way only so far as the high road towards Sens had left in my mind an image as obstinate as the smell of warm dust in one's nostrils. That image was of the three dormers in the steep slate of the house opposite the inn, and of some movement slight as the stirring of lace in a draught at the left-hand window of the lower floor. It must have been no more than the settling of a curtain, yet it had precisely the air of a person who, having watched, withdraws. On the morrow, having left my bicycle to be looked to, for a pedal had worked loose, I returned to Marcilly by a diligence that went no further than a village on the way, and finished the journey on foot. The skies were of that high, pale blue which carries so little warmth. The stubble fields held their crows, and there was, as I approached the place, a noise of hammering which I afterwards discovered to come from repairs to a stable roof in a lane behind the three-gabled house. It will surprise no one that I made some pretext for admittance to the house. I have, I think, as much diffidence as the next man. But the mention of a carved chimney-piece is to me what the word rare is to a bookman. I sent in by the maid a small, brown person with intelligent eyes. My card, upon which I had written that I was an English traveller with some interest in old French woodwork, and begged, if it were not inconvenient to Madame, to be permitted to look at the fireplace which I had been told was remarkable. I was kept waiting only so long as it takes to compose a face. She came to me in the little anteroom, a woman past the middle age with heavy, regular features, a high colour that sat oddly in the hollows of her cheeks, and the faint shadow of hair upon the upper lip, which I had noticed on my vis-à-vis of the train. I will not be so rash as to swear that they were one and the same, but the likeness was sufficient to set my heart beating with that unreasonable quickness which attends the recognition of a face seen before in a place where it has no right to be. "Mais certainement, monsieur," said she, in a voice slightly roughened, "one must show the little that we have." The room which contained the chimney-piece lay to the left of the corridor, a square-panelled salon, darkened by the plane trees in the Place and by the depth of its embrasures. The mantel was of oak, deep-carved with fruits and masks, and in the centre a shield borne by two grotesques. I confess the workmanship was of better quality than I had expected. Above, the over-mantel contained 3 niches. In the middle niche, a small seated figure in low relief, with a staff which might be Saint Loup, patron of Sens and of the diocese. "You have kept this very well, madame," I said, for the surface was clean, and not overmuch worm-eaten. She made a motion of the hand which might mean it keeps itself. Then, after an immaterial pause, "You are interested in old books, too. One sees it." She glanced, and I thought not without a touch of mistrust, at the volume which I had under my arm, the unfortunate Caroline. "In such measure as I can pretend," said I, "and indeed one of the books I lately bought carries a name which belongs here. I hope I do not take a liberty, Madame Giraud, if I ask whether your late husband—" The effect of the name was small on the features, but I was aware of a perceptible hardening at the corners of the mouth, as if a lace had been pulled tighter. "My late husband," she said, "was called Émile. Yes, it is a common name. And your book, monsieur?" I told her the little that there was to tell, the curiosity shop, the random choice, the conversation that had so oddly mirrored my own situation in the train. And here I hesitated the suggestion, made in the same chapter, that one who wished to know whether the mistress of a certain house were interesting should ask what she kept beneath the pavement of the farther corner of her stable. It is one thing to hear the words again in the privacy of one's mind, another to utter them to the person whom they may concern. I did not look at her while I spoke. There was a silence at the end of it which I now perceive was longer than delicacy required. When at last I raised my eyes, I saw that her hand had travelled up to the lace at her throat and gathered it, and that her gaze, which had been upon me, had shifted past me towards the square of the window, as if to measure the distance to the street. "Monsieur," she said slowly, "one does not speak of stables to a lady. It is not the thing. You are English, and without malice, I suppose. But you will oblige me by forgetting that a book of amusements for young persons has mentioned my house. If you wish to see more of our poor Marcilly, the curé will tell you of the church, which is old, and of a stone with letters, which no one reads now. Shall I send for my maid to show you?" I stammered an apology that was, I hope, sufficiently humble, and permitted myself to be conveyed back to the corridor. There she made me a small bow, which was not without dignity, and I, for my part, walked out into the place with that most grateful of all permissions, the permission to be ashamed. It is a rule with me that when I have once made a blunder through indiscretion, I seek to repair it by pursuing my object through some other door. Thus it was that after half an hour's cooling of my head under the plane trees and a glass of very thin beer at the inn, I made my way to the presbytery. The curé of Marcilly, his name was Delot, received me with a courtesy which did not exclude shrewdness. He was of the sort which James I is said to have liked in bishops, of a good life and no beard. We spoke at his instance of England, at mine of St. Loup, whose figure in bas-relief I had noticed on Madame Giraud's mantel. Thereupon he told me of certain 17th-century repairs in the church, and we went together to see the font and a small iron-bound chest in the sacristy, which he unlocked to show me a fragment of parchment with a painted initial. These were matters upon which we could meet without reserve. Not until he had himself adverted to the Girauds, for in a village all roads are one, did I permit myself any question. "Madame is a brave woman," said he, folding up the parchment with finical care, "and much tried. There was some years ago a misfortune. Her husband did not return. That is all we know. There was the talk, you imagine. The earth is generous of talk. But the law could not help her, nor the church. She keeps her house and pays her pew rent. That is the history." "And there is, pardon me, a stable at the back of the house?" I asked. He looked at me with a sudden dryness. "But certainly there is a stable. We are not in Paris." And I stopped, for the curé's eyes had become as small as pinheads. "Monsieur," he said, "there is a thing I tell to children who pry in the drawers of their parents. You will disturb what sleeps better in order, and you will make for yourself a night that is long. You are a learned gentleman, and will not be offended by advice. In Marcilly we do not speak of that house. If you are a Catholic, no. Yet you will think of a candle for the dead when you next come into a church. It is always of use. There was no more to be had." I returned to the inn, and for want of better occupation, I set myself to sketch the elevation of the house with 3 gables from my window. I am no draftsman, but the act of drawing compels the eye to measure, and while I traced the triangles of the dormers and the swell of the cornice above the ground floor, I became aware of 2 small discrepancies which, being architectural, are difficult to express without a plan. The first was that, whereas the 2 outer dormers were centered with the windows beneath them, the middle dormer stood slightly to the right of the middle window line, as if it had been inserted to light something that was not precisely in the middle. The second was that the balcony rail of the first floor, a slender iron bar with a pattern of twists, stopped short by perhaps a foot before it reached the left-hand jamb, and the end of it had been neatly turned inward and fastened to the wall. The stone there showed a faint, smoother patch, as if, I thought, some small fixed thing had once been attached and was now gone. These are niceties which no sane man reports to a friend at dinner. I mention them because they were among the trifles that made up my obsession. In the night I was waked by a sound that was at once near and very far, the sound of a slow draught being drawn somewhere, like the breathing of a bellows under a floor. When I sat up, all was quiet. The plane leaves tapped the gutter with their usual little noises. The sign of the inn creaked as it had done every hour. And there was, I am ashamed to say, a taste of fear in my mouth, not unlike that which salt leaves after a wave has been taken over the head. Morning brought some relief, and also my bicycle from the smith, which had been dropped at the inn by cart. I made my apologies to Madame Giraud on a small card, and left them at her door with a little packet of English tea, which I thought might be taken as a peace offering. Then I rode back to Troyes, and there, in the quiet of an upper room looking on a laundry court, I took out Caroline de Lichtenfeld, with the sensible intention of comparing the text I remembered with what was there. You already know the result. The chapter which contained the dialogue could not be found because the choirs which should have contained it were not present. I will add only one further particular. The fly-leaf, which had borne the name Émile Giraud in a feminine hand, now bore only the faintest smear where the words had been. It is quite possible, and I suppose more than probable, that I had imprinted upon the page some accident of light that was never there in the ink. Yet I do not think it was so, for while I still had the volume open upon my knee, a small, square slip of paper slid from between two leaves and fell on the floor. It was of the kind used for sermon notes, and upon it, penciled with care by a hand which had sharpened its point frequently, was set out a familiar little word square: Siren Image Range Egged Needy. I remember that I laughed, not out of mirth, but because this was the last thing I wished to have provided, the sight of a private monogram in the very room of my fear. I do not pretend to decipher such toys, but I could not help observing that if one took the middle letters on the downward slant, I-A-A-G-E, they spelled nothing, whereas the outer ring S-E-Y-N-D could, in a coarser mood, be forced into S-Y-N-D-E-N, which is nonsense. It occurred to me later that the outer ring, read widdershins and with the old liberty of transposition, comes near enough to Dennis, and St. Denis, as every schoolboy knows, is the bishop who carries his head. In short, I put the paper into the book again and resolved to attend to my supper. The resolution lasted until dusk, at which hour a boy from Marcilly arrived with my bicycle pump, which I had left behind me. He was a lively specimen, with that vivacity of eye which belongs to the Champagne country. I gave him a glass of lemonade in the courtyard and asked, as one asks boys, whether there was anything to see in Marcilly beyond the carved fireplace. He thought there was the stable at Madame Giraud's. "It has a corner of pavement that is newer than the rest," said he, "and we did not put it there. That was before my uncle's time. But if one puts one's ear to the ground there—" He illustrated with an attitude that would have pleased a photographer. One hears a poof, poof like that. I have heard it. My uncle beat me. "And has anyone broken the corner?" He looked at me as if I'd proposed to take off the roof. "On n'ose pas. If one strikes there, the tools slip. That is what my uncle says. And if a man goes into the stable at night, he comes out with his mouth full of straw, like the horses, and knows nothing of it till he is told in the morning. You may ask the men at the inn. C'est arrivé." I gave the boy his piece and sent him off, and having by this time discovered my own project, I went to the desk of the terminus and asked the landlady whether a country mason could be had for the morrow to do a small job at Marcilly. "There is one at Les Croûtes," said she, "a good one. He mends the steps of the church there. He will not go at night." "Nor I," said I, and we smiled politely at one another. I am well aware that at this point my conduct will appear to some persons to have been either officious or unsound. I can only plead that I did not propose to commit outrage upon a lady's property. I meant only to set to the test a childish superstition, and to make, if I could, a sketch of the undersurface of a flagged floor. There are persons who will cross the Rhine to see a cellar because it is Roman. I would cross it for a French stable because of a sentence in a silly novel. Accordingly, at 11 of the forenoon, we presented ourselves the mason, a square, freckled man called Potier, with a bag of tools and a polite indifference, the innkeeper to supply, as he said, du courage, and I to inflict myself upon the mistress and obtain permission. We were received by the maid, and presently, to my surprise, and I confess relief, Madame herself came through the dark passage and asked our business. When I told her plainly, adding that I would be answerable for any injury or any fee she might name, she listened with a look that I cannot describe otherwise than by saying that it pressed upon my face as a hand might. "It is not permitted," said she at last. "There is nothing there. You will break the floor and disturb my horses, which are old. Go away, I beg you. I am ashamed to record that I persisted. There is a bad vein in most men." Perhaps I was thinking of the curé's pinched eyes, perhaps of the boy's poof-poof through the flags. I asked whether, if we found nothing, the flags might be replaced at my cost in better cement than before. The mason here interposed civilly to say that the work would be done with a care which should satisfy a bishop. Madame replied, not to him but to me, with a question that made me hot to the ears. "Monsieur veut-il voir mon écurie pour savoir si je suis intéressante?" She did not smile, nor did I. "Come then," she said curtly, and turning her back upon us, she went before us with a key in her hand to a door that opened on the lane. The stable was small and clean. The light entered grudgingly by a square opening high up. There were 2 stalls, one empty, one with an old white horse whose long, down-grown hair hung like moss from a willow. He turned his head and looked at us with the clouded eye of patience. Madame pointed to the far right-hand corner, where indeed the flags showed a better face than elsewhere. And there was also this, that whereas the rest lay flat, and even with their neighbours, one at the very meeting of the 2 walls had the faintest inclination, so faint that, had not the dust rim betrayed it, it would have escaped me towards the angle as a book drops to its hinge when the shelf is not true. Pottier knelt and tried his pick. It slipped, and he made a small exclamation which left the white horse perfectly unmoved, but caused Madame to draw a breath through her nostrils that I heard distinctly. He tried again, changing his point a little, and this time there was a dull, clinking resistance, not of stone against iron, but of iron on some thin thing which yields and then refuses such a sound as the lid of a tin box makes when the knife runs under it. "What is it?" I asked. "A plate," said Pottier. "Very thin, and underneath there is air, for I feel the hollowness. This will be longer than I supposed." He worked with a patience that increased my respect for him and diminished my courage. The white horse, after one soft blowing out of breath, resigned the matter to Providence, and drowsed. Madame stood with her hand upon the doorpost and watched. Presently the pick slipped again, but this time with a noise that I should know among 1,000, the noise of something that gives way not because you break it, but because the thing beyond it catches hold and draws. I have no other words. Pottier swore softly, and I found that I had moved backwards so that my shoulders were against the flank of the horse. He did not stir. Madame said, "It is nothing," but the colour had ebbed out of her cheeks. At length the plate yielded at one corner. Pottier levered up a square of flag, which had been most cleverly bedded upon it, and beneath we saw a black space not more than a foot deep, the sides of which were lined roughly with bricks set on edge. Pottier put in his hand and withdrew it immediately with a cry which he stifled in his sleeve. His knuckles were bleeding. "There is wire," he said, "or nails bent inwards, a foolishness to keep out rats. Lend me the tongs, monsieur." With the tongs he drew forth the first of several objects, little packets, wrapped in cloth, which had once been white, and was now the colour of ashes. They were tied with a thread which broke when he touched it. He looked at me, and, at a sign, opened one. It contained in this, I will be brief, clippings of hair, both of a man and of a woman, and parings of nails. The second contained the same, with something else which I recognized with more emotion than I like to remember. the portion of a little finger, dried to horn. The third, well, the third was heavier. It proved to be a bag with metal corners and a ring. Potier pulled. Something inside held it. He pulled again with an oath. The thing came up with a jerk, and with it there came, attached by a strip of leather that had stiffened like a board, an object that slid up the brick side and presented itself, most slowly over the edge into the light. It was a face. It was not a skull. Do not suppose that I would use that word where it would not be strict. There was skin upon it, no doubt, toughened and dried by the place. The eyes were sunk to a depth that seemed to be measured rather than guessed. And the mouth, this was the worst, had been pressed long and flat against something, so that the lips were spread out upon the teeth, and the corners were drawn back as a child draws them back when it makes a mask in a glass. The whole thing was of a colour between yellow and grey, with spots of mould like islands on a chart. Where the cheeks ended towards the ears, the hair came down scantily, and in that hair I saw, incredibly absurd, and yet wholly damnable, 2 or 3 short, black bristles, such as grow upon the lip of a woman. Madame made a sound that I will not set down. Potier let fall the tongs, the bag, and the face dropped together into the hole, and lay there in a puddle of blackness, which I knew very well was no liquid, and yet looked for all the world like tar. I had my senses so far that I put my hand upon Madame's sleeve and said, in English, I believe, though it mattered little, "You shall not faint here." She did not. She stood firm, and after an instant, with a movement that was inexpressibly courageous or inexpressibly wicked, I cannot resolve which, she went to the wall, took from a nail a short spade, such as women use in gardens, and thrust it down upon the thing in the hole with a force that sent a little white puff of mortar out from between the bricks. Potier recovered himself first. "Ça suffit," said he hoarsely. "We put back the flag. No one has seen. It is a matter for the gendarmes, but not for me." He was right. I had wit enough left to say to Madame, "I am at your orders. If you wish this to be known, I will go to the mayor." If not, I made a gesture towards the flag. She looked from me to the hole, and from the hole to the white horse. He had raised his head and was sniffing with the mildest of curiosities. Then she said, in a voice that had no breath in it, "Cover it. There is no one. It is mine." We put back the plate and the flag, and Potier stood upon it and smote it into place with the wooden end of his tool. Madame had gone to the door and stood with her back against it. When the last sound ceased, there was a silence like the minute after a bell dies. Then, very quietly, I heard it once more, the poof, poof of a slow breath drawn under the floor. We came out into the lane. Madame locked the stable and gave the key to the maid, who had been sitting on the threshold of the scullery and had seen nothing. She went before us to the front of the house, and there, turning, held out her hand. I touched it with mine. It was not cold as I had expected, but hot and dry like a brick that has been in the sun. I would not lengthen this recital by an account of what followed immediately. The appeal to the mayor, the instant telegraphing to Troyes for the examining magistrate, the respectful but extremely practical interest of the gendarmerie. I was present next day when the space beneath the flags was emptied. It contained, besides what I have already named, certain coins of the period of Napoleon III, a small book of prayers with a metal clasp, on the outside of which the name E. Giraud had been scratched with something sharp. And this I did not see, but was told the remnant of a waistcoat with a tailor's tab from Troyes. Of human remains there were more than enough to justify an inquest, but I think no single bone was removed without a protest from the stable itself. There was, throughout the proceedings, a resistance not of persons, but of place. Tools blunted, mortar refused to set. One of the gendarmes, a man of a jocular habit, came out with a mouthful of straw which he protested he had not taken in. The magistrate laughed and bade him go and rinse, but I observed that he drank his wine later with a certain slowness. It is not my business to repeat the finding of the court, nor could I, if I would, recite the depositions as they were taken. The substance was, as you may foretell, that Monsieur Émile Giraud, being a person of means and method, had been murdered in his own stable on a Friday afternoon when he went to fetch money for his men, that he had been smothered, for the marks on the ribs and the shape of the face made that likely, and that his body had been disposed in the cavity already prepared, along with certain superstitious trumperies designed, no doubt, to stay inquiry by means which I will not set down. Of the author or authors of the deed the court was chary. There were suggestions, and there were facts, and between them sat Madame, who, being confronted with some piece of testimony which I shall not here repeat, put her hand to her mouth, as if she were minded to keep in something that pressed. Towards evening, when the house had been given back to her for the night, and the gendarmes had left a man at the door, I went once more to the curé. I found him in his church, kneeling in the dark below the rood. He rose at once and came with me to the sacristy, where there is a chair which must be used by all who have news. I told him what you have, so far, heard, and he listened with his head a little on one side, like a bird. "Eh bien," said he at last, "there is justice of a sort. But she will not sleep this night, nor will you. You will do well to go to Troyes." "I shall go in the morning," said I, "when I've made one more inquiry. There is a book I must see." And I told him of Caroline de Lichtenfeld, and of the chapter which is not in my copy, and must, if it exists at all, be sought elsewhere. He shook his head in a manner that was more compassionate than incredulous. "Mon ami," said he, "a book that says more than its author wrote is more dangerous than gunpowder. Burn it. I did not, for I am a fool in certain matters." I returned to my room at the inn and opened. My poor Caroline once more. It opened of itself at a place which I had not cut. The leaves fell apart like lips. There, on the inner margin of page 81, was something that might have been an impression of damp. And upon that damp, very faintly, lines as of writing which has been transferred from another leaf. I tilted the book to the candle and read, if not with my eyes, then with that sense which persuades the eyes, words which I can set down without more than 3 lapses. You were looking at the person opposite you. You will see her this evening. Marcilly-le-Hayer, what she keeps under the pavement. There were other words, 2 or 3 names, a number, and the last line, which was so clear that I could not but doubt it, was "Ne prenez pas cette route, do not take that road." I can tell you exactly what I did, for like most men who have been children with an imagination, I am an excellent actor to myself. I shut the book, blew out the candle, lay down upon the bed with my face away from the window, and put the clothes over my head. This is a heroic remedy, and one which I recommend to no man who has not first seen that his door is locked. My door was not locked. When I became aware of this, the room had already grown not so much darker as thicker, and there was, just below the window, a sound of something that rubbed upon the sill as a cat rubs when it is tired of being indifferent. I do not know at what precise point the sound became a breath, nor when the breath ceased to be outside the room and began to be within, nor when the thing that breathed found by some instinct unknown to men the exact path by which to arrive at the side of my bed. I know only that I could bear the bedclothes no longer, and that when I cast them back and sat up, I saw in the grey square that is the first shaping of light a figure very close to me, so close that I had not the whole of it in my field. It was stooping. Its hands, if it had hands, were spread. The head, oh, spare me, was pressed forward and flattened upon the air, as if there were still between it and me a plate of glass against which it strained. I felt on my face the dull, warm exhalation of something that has been long in a closed place. Then it was gone. How? All at once, as a moth goes when you strike at it in the dusk, and it is not there. In the morning, I went to the library at Troyes and asked for Caroline de Lichtenfeld in any edition they might have. They produced 3. The oldest of them, printed at Lausanne, had nothing in the place where my phantom chapter should have been. The latest, of 1820, contained a paragraph in which the heroine and her confidant discuss the inoffensive pleasures of a life retired from the world and no more. The third, which bore upon its title page the date 1788, and had evidently belonged to a provincial reader who liked to cut his leaves with a dinner knife, had at page 43 a smear of something that looked like glue, and opposite to it, upon the fly-leaf, words which I copied carefully before they faded, if indeed they faded and were not merely a trick of my cowardly hand. "Hôtel des Ambassadeurs this evening, Marcilly. Ask the stable, do not take that road." I have kept that piece of paper, but I have not kept my copy of Caroline. I took the curé's advice, or rather I obeyed an impulse whose advice was not his. I burned it in the stove of my room and thought the stove smelt oddly while it did its office. What remains? Little, and enough. Madame Giraud left Marcilly within the month. I have heard since from a gentleman in Troyes who is concerned with titles and estates that certain claims were preferred by remote relations of the deceased, that the house with the 3 gables stands long untenanted, and that when at last a merchant from Nogent took it upon a lease and repaired the roof of the stable, his workmen came one morning without eyes in their heads for anything but sleep. They had, it seems, lain down upon the hay after dinner, which was contrary to order, and when the foreman rebuked them, they stared at him and each other with an innocence that would have deceived Pontius Pilate. "Our mouths," said one, "were full of straw." The foreman laughed and told them to spit it out. They did so, and there was straw. I do not pretend to account for the chapter which is not in Montolieu's book, nor for the face that is not in any collection of anatomical monstrosities. I record what I saw, I withhold what I believe. If you ask me whether I think Madame Giraud intended that the thing should be found, I will say that when she put her hand upon that little garden spade, I loved her less and respected her more. If you ask whether I suppose the person opposite me in the train to have been she, I will answer that there are likenesses which do not need identity to accomplish their errand. And if, lastly, you inquire whether I have ever since travelled with an odd volume of a French novel in my bag, I can assure you that I have not, and that when I pass a stable lane in a small town, I do so with my head very high and my mouth very much shut. For there is one thing of which I am tolerably certain. Those who trifle with pavements in the farther corners of stables, be they inquisitive Englishmen or housewives with good reasons, will do well to remember that the air which lies under stones is no longer the air which God made for men. I remained in Troyes for 3 days, and in each of them I made a beginning at leaving, and in each I found some excuse to linger. The curé's last words had not so much warned me away as fixed a pin through the map. You will do well to go to Troyes, and, like certain insects, I continued to circle back to the pin. My most serviceable pretext was the public sale that had been ordered of sundry articles from the house with the three gables. It was not to be the furniture, there was little of that, to tempt a buyer, but the mantel and overmantel in the left-hand salon, so I read on a printed affiche, together with 2 oak presses, a long table, and a set of 12 chairs, all said to be of the last century. The sale was deferred for a fortnight to allow of the formalities, but the expert from Troyes who had drawn up the notice was to view and describe the articles within the week. I knew the man slightly, and like all men who know their own weakness, I told myself that I would go once with him to verify his descriptions, and so cure myself of my curiosity by exhausting it. We drove together to Marcilly in a little hired trap that smelt of oilcloth and wool. He was of that sort of provincial connoisseur whom one meets often in France. Dry, exact, honest as to wood and date, credulous in nothing but his own nose for a bargain. He spoke very tolerably of the mantel at our first glimpse of it, bonne province, fin d'X-septième, and tapped gently along its lower ledge while the dust jumped and lay again. The 3 niches of the over-mantel he dismissed with a movement of the lips. Il y avait des statuettes, he said. On les a enlevées. Dommage. I told him that I had seen a small figure seated in the middle niche. He shook his head. On vous aura montré Saint-Loup à l'église. Celui-ci a été décollé, and he made a little slicing motion with the side of his hand. Voyez les coupes sous la douleur. He pointed out beneath the crest of the central niche 2 shallow scores. The carving there also was less black than elsewhere, as if a man's hand had for years warmed that exact patch whenever he stood with his back to the fire. He had out his notebook and was setting down measurements when the maid, whom I had seen before, came softly to us, hesitated, and then, with an eagerness she could not quite conceal, said that Madame begged 2 words with me in the corridor. I went at once. This was before her eventual departure. Madame stood there with the strangest air I had yet seen on a human face, not grief, not anger, but that scorched look of one who has leaned too close to a very hot oven and felt the hair on the temples singe. She spoke low and rapidly, in sentences that hardly touched. Monsieur will do me this kindness not to speak of what is in the lane. These men with the hammer, one has a laugh, cela m'épuise. They strike, and all day there is under the stones a person that returns breath for breath. The gendarmes went away. It is all in order. The magistrate will write his paper. Then why do they strike? I am not wicked. No, I have worked. I have paid what is due. I will not stay. I cannot. In 8 days, I go to my cousin near Nevers. Tenez, if monsieur wishes for that wood in the salon, he will write that he bids for it through the expert, and he shall have it. But not the niche. No, that stays. That is mine. Her hand made again that little motion that had startled me once before, a very small gathering at the throat, as if she drew the skin there together with 2 fingers. You will pardon, she added, that I have spoken much. It is not that I fear what is dead. I fear what continues. The expert came out, his pencil behind his ear, and we parted with the civilities that may be exchanged across a gulf. I said nothing of the stable to him. Indeed, we did not go round by the lane. But as we stood for a moment at the door of the house, his draughtsman's eye travelled up and down the front, as mine had done from the inn window, and I heard him say, half under his breath, Toujours, cette bizarrerie la lucarne, au milieu qui fuit son axe. And then, more loudly, with an air of hypocrisy which deceives no one, Vous savez, monsieur, que la place est belle, et que les maisons regardent. Comme ça he tilted his chin, and narrowed his eyes. Quand elles veulent garder un secret. It was a mannerism of his to speak thus to the air. I should have laughed. But the day was still, and my laugh went no further than my teeth. I bought the mantel and the long table at the sale. They were not dispatched to me for some weeks, for, as was proper, the heirs-at-law disputed the value set upon these fixtures, and there were papers to be prepared. Meanwhile, I pursued in Troyes the history of Caroline de Lichtenfeld. I found, not without pains and the mortification of appearing in more than one bookseller's doorway, that the book was as dull and as durable as any of its race, and that it had left behind it a score of editions differing as little as ants differ, who are all bent the same way. Only in 2 of these was there evidence of anything like interpolation, and of the 2, one was a Brussels reprint crammed with misprints, and the other a provincial issue in which the binder had played tricks with the quires, so that the page, numbers told a story of their own that the text could not keep up with. In neither was there a chapter of warnings and hotel doors and three-gabled houses. There was only, as I have said, that occasional smear which a coward may mistake for ink and which a bolder man might test with a wet finger. I did not test it. It was near the end of October, when I was summoned by letter to be present, if I chose, at the taking down of the mantel and its packing. The artisan employed by the auctioneer was, I was assured, competent and careful, but a signature would be needed when the crate was made. I admit I was glad of the errand. The trees in the place were almost bare now. The leaves lay under them in a shallow carpet, and the wind that comes across plains was in the square, turning the heap this way and that, as if to see what it had got. The gendarme no longer watched the door. There was a paper pasted there announcing that the house would be shut for the winter and that inquiries might be made of the notary at Troyes. I found the workmen already busy. 2 within, with their planks and straw, one on the step, rubbing with a rag at the little patch of stone where the balcony rail ended short. He left off when I went in, but I had seen that there was upon the patch the ghost of a mark, an oval, perhaps 6 inches long, as of a plate that had been let in and removed. I could not resist asking him what he did. He answered without impertinence that when one makes a fine crate, the dust from outside clung worse than anything to the ropes, and that he liked the step to be clean. A boy might have blushed better. Within, they had unseated the shelf of the mantel and were easing free the long uprights of the over-mantel. The wood beneath came away redder than the rest, like the inside of a nut when the shell first splits. There were holes where the statuettes had stood, and in the centre niche there was, behind the place where the figure's back should have rested, a small square opening no bigger than the palm of a hand, closed by a plate of tin fixed with 2 small nails. "Ça, c'est pour les souris," said the man cheerfully, and put his thumb to it. At the first pressure, the corner gave a trifle. At the second, the plate sprang inward with a crack and fell. A little puff of air came out, no worse than the breath of an old cupboard, and with it came, sliding gently as if it had been waiting upon a slope, a packet folded in coarse paper and tied with cotton. It is the most difficult thing in the world to behave discreetly before 3 curious adults. I took up the packet, weighed it in my hand, and said the first nonsense that occurred to me, that it must be a pamphlet lost by some workman when the chimney had been cleansed. The men were too fully engaged, besides, with their own screws and wedges to insist, and I was permitted to put the thing in my pocket and walk away with it to the door as if I had merely gone for air. There, I opened it, with a care which one uses commonly for letters from the dead. It contained 3 leaves of a cheap account book covered closely in pencil in a woman's hand. 2 were filled with the items of a housekeeping week: bread, a pig's trotter, fine salt, peas, needles. The 3rd was very different. It was a little prayer, such as women write to God when they are most lonely and most ignorant. And below this, line after line, scrawled and broken, as if a hand that was being called suddenly might yet set down 2 or 3 words before it went. I will not give you the prayer. It is not my property. The broken lines were these. I copy them in the spelling of the pencil. My Emile, to be pardoned if anyone has taken him away from me without the sacraments, if the Mass of Saint. Lou may count for him as if it were said in his hearing, I will eat no meat on Fridays. I will not look out when the fair comes if they ask me, where is he? I will say, I do not know, for I do not know if I am wicked to see the earth lift when I pass under the pavement. Do not let him press me when I sleep. Do not let him press me. Do not let. Your own mind will supply the word that failed her. I put the papers back into their coarse envelope and replaced the hole in my pocketbook. I had no doubt now, if I had ever permitted myself to doubt, that we had found the very place towards which the unfortunate woman's courage had conducted and deserted her many times, and that, whatever complicity may have existed in the deed itself, there had been for years a penance, very private, very punctual, and very much alone. By dusk the crate was ready. We nailed upon it a label for my carrier in Calais, and I stood for a last moment in the empty salon. The marks of the mantel made upon the wall an inverted phantom of itself. The 3 niches were 3 pale lozenges where the light took the plaster differently from elsewhere. The floor showed a little litter of oak dust, like snuff. I had then that sensation which is common, I suppose, to those who have assisted at exhumations, and not otherwise common. A feeling that the room, without the peace which had belonged to it for 100 years, drew together upon itself like a blanket about a man who is cold, and that, since the blanket was too small, something would presently push through where the chill was keenest. It was ridiculous to remain, and I went. I slept that night at the inn and woke once with a certainty that the crate was breathing. In the morning the carter came and took it. I watched him edge it out upon his corded sledge through the door and over the threshold. It passed the little smoothed patch beside the step and left no mark upon it. The boy I had once given lemonade to came up and walked with the horse, and when they had turned by the plane trees into the road, he put his ear to the side of the crate, in that absurd attitude I had seen before, and then laughed aloud, but not merrily. "Ça ronfle," he said to me, and went off running behind the cart like a dog. In due time the mantle came safe to my lodging in England, and later to the house where for some years I have had the misfortune to be considered comfortable. I had it put up in my smaller sitting-room, which is never used for company, and there, I confess, I have enjoyed it exceedingly. The wood took kindly to our coal fire, and in winter, when the curtains are drawn at 4, there is a sort of glow that comes out of old oak, which is like the remembrance of cider in a barrel. I kept carefully the 3 leaves from the packet, pressing them between blotting paper in a little quarto of Bordeaux sermons, and I did not show them to more than one friend who is the kind of man that hears such things without making you ashamed of them afterwards. Indeed, in the first months I had almost persuaded myself that my French adventure had been the mere overflow of a mind too much alone. There were evenings when I could laugh decorously at the image of myself sitting up in bed with the clothes over my head, and there were mornings when I could say to myself that the breath under the flags was the breath of a child's imagination that had persisted into its manhood. I should have left it so. It is usual with men of my disposition to behave well until they are tempted. The occasion of the temptation was singularly trivial. In the early spring I received from the expert at Troyes a packet of photographs. He had, he said, discovered. In a dealer's stock lay a group of prints of provincial houses, taken about 1870 by an itinerant photographer who had a habit of planting his camera in the square of any little town and selling, for a sou apiece, a vue du bourg, which he afterwards hawked back to the inhabitants. Among these was a view of Marcilly-le-Hayer, better quality than those examples he sent which I was to return. As for the print, he mentioned, he thought I might care for it as a memento of my mantel, and, should I wish to have it, I was to remit the modest sum of 5 francs. I sent him 10, for I am not above buying gratitude and the photograph. It is a tolerable piece of work. The plane trees are in full leaf. A man with a pipe crosses the place. The three-gabled house presents its front very clear. There is the balcony with its iron rail. There are the dormers, the middle still not quite on its axis. There is the patch beside the step, and upon the balcony, fixed to the left-hand jamb where the stone is smoother, is the plate that had been removed before I came, an oval of metal with an inscription upon it. The print is small and will not bear enlarging with a glass, however one may still make out the lower line, Des Ambassadeurs, and above it, faint and backward, Hotel. In brief, it was the plate of the name I had seen palimpsested at Troyes, so the house here had carried it before the fashion moved. The ambassadeurs had not shifted as stones shift, but as a name. It is in Troyes now and calls itself the terminus. The oval had hung here first, and afterwards followed the name. And it was then plain why the middle dormer stood out of true. It had been so contrived in the inn days that a noon shaft might run the passage and strike upon a single flag in the stable, the stone used when men made vows for the road. That the house had borne the style des ambassadeurs is not immaterial. An inn stables more vows than horses, and such places by long handling learn to keep them. I had a foolish pleasure in fitting the old sign to the new place, as a man will who cannot endure that labels should not be straight. But there was more, though I saw it at a second looking. In the lower left of the photograph, in the shadow of the doorway, stands a woman whose face is turned a very little towards the camera. The mouth is indistinguishable, the nose is a dab of shadow, but upon the upper lip there is just that little crescent which we put into a cartoon when we wish to mark a moustache without the pains of hair. She holds in her right hand a book, shut upon a finger. I do not say that it was a volume of Caroline de Lichtenfeld. I say that, having seen that shadow, I put the print away for some weeks, and then gave it a frame with a back to it, so that I might not be haunted by the irregularities of a paper that will not lie flat. It was about this time that the first of the small domestic annoyances set in, which are tedious to a reader and have their interest for the subject alone. I will confine myself to those which bear upon the matter. The chief was an obstinate shifting of the draught in that room, so that, whichever window I opened, the flame in the grate would lean and make a smut in a corner which no sweep could afterwards quite obliterate. If I closed the window, the flame stood. If I opened it again, it leaned afresh. But now, by some perverse trick of the air, to the other corner. The smuts so made took to themselves odd shapes, once the flat oval of a plate, once something that would have been a face if there had been more forehead to it. Once, most absurdly, a little rectangle with 2 dots beneath, such as a child draws when it first discovers the convenience of eyes. I had the flue examined. It was in order. I had the room papered afresh. The smuts began again on the new paper. At last I burned anthracite for a fortnight, and the smuts left off. They left off, that is, in the chimney corner, but I found on a wet morning that the inside of the left-hand niche in the overmantel, where the statuette had been, was faintly darkened, as if a hand, not quite clean, had pressed there while it leaned out to listen. There are men who will carry a jest very far with themselves. I began now to practice inoculation against fear by obliging myself to go nightly, when I had shut up the house, to stand for a minute with my back to the mantel and to look straight before me into the mirror between the windows. It is a plain mirror without bevel. The first nights were excellent, for nothing is so brave as the man who is watched by himself behaving well. Then, about the 10th night, I became aware that my face in the glass was not quite so near the glass as I had supposed. It was as if a thin pane had been interposed between me and it, and I observed with some amusement that the small lamp flame at my side showed a double image in the lower half of the mirror, but not in the upper. The explanation, when I chose to seek it, was easy enough. The silvering of the glass has its thicknesses. The next evening I saw that the double image had crept a little higher. On the 3rd, it came to the level of my mouth. On the 4th, to my nose. On the 5th, the matter is too childish, I blew out the lamp and went to bed. In the dark, there was a sound, as of something that stroked the belly of the mantel-shelf from beneath, with the flat of a hand. This is the point at which a wise man sells furniture to a person who deserves it. I did not. I took the 3 little leaves again from the Bordeaux sermons and read the last lines by daylight. I then did a thing which will seem to some people excessive. I carried the leaves to church and laid them, folded, upon the altar rail, while I sat for a quarter of an hour and found out that I could not say a prayer to save my life. When I took them up again, I noticed that by some accident of light or moisture, the pencil had made a transfer upon the rail, and there, plainly legible, was the sentence which had fallen twice under my eyes before: Ne me laissez pas me presser dans le sommeil. The rail was of varnished wood. I rubbed the words with my sleeve, and they went. When I looked a 3rd time, they were there again, but fainter. And when I went out into the air, they had vanished for good. There followed then the incident which drove the matter to a head. I had been on a visit for some days in the West, and returned late at night by a train that does not wait for reasonable men. There was no one to meet me. I walked home, and because the night was quiet and the moon stood over the chimneys in a very pretty fashion, I went round by the little wicket that leads into my strip of garden at the back, thinking to enter by the French window of the room that holds the mantel. The window was uncurtained, for I had left in haste, and the moon, falling between the uprights, striped the hearth-rug with a ladder of pale bars. I have not the habit of dramatics. I tell you simply what I saw. Upon the hearth, a little within the fender, lying as a man lies when he is tired of kneeling and allows himself to fall forward, was the impress of a thing that had lain its face down and its hands flat, so flat that the hands were not hands but fans, and the face was not a face but a round with 2 little patches for eyes. The coal had silted over it with the finest ash. The bars of the grate had made at the top of the circle a faint ribbing as of iron upon skin. And this you will not credit, unless you have an eye for trifles the ash had taken up somehow. A very small quantity of moisture, so that, where the lips would have been, there was a darker crescent, as if a man had breathed there and his breath had wet the dust. I did not, as you might suppose, rush in and tread it out. I stood a long minute outside, and because I could not prevent the thought, I said to myself aloud, I am afraid, if you will rise when I come in, I will bear it. The absurdity of this bargain restored me. I entered briskly, laid my hand upon the mantel-shelf, and struck the bell that communicates with the pantry. The bell rang, and as the wire took the last of its oscillations, the thing on the hearth passed. It did not go out, as a shadow goes when light is withdrawn. It did not break. It did not run. It made itself thin. It went in towards the hearth-piece and became, in a time measurable by counting 4, a very faint brown upon the oak there, which, as I looked, was only the natural darkness of old wood in a corner. My man came and lighted candles. I told him that some soot had fallen. He took the brush and the scoop, and, with that officiousness which is of the essence of service, was about to sweep where there was nothing to sweep. I stopped him. I could not endure that his little gestures should be for a moment coincident with what I had seen. He said, "Very good, sir," and went away a wise man. I did not sleep in the house that night. The next day I began to do what wise men do last. I wrote to a dealer whom I do not greatly love because he does not greatly love me, and offered him a mantelpiece. He replied instantly with a figure which, though indecent, was wholesome. We haggled for 3 days for the honour of our professions, and on the 4th he came. He admired without impertinence. He had men with him, and before tea-time the mantel was again a crate with a label. But this time the label was not mine. They took it at once. The room stood with a square upon the wall where it had been. I sat there till it was dusk, for I am obstinate in finishing things. Then I rose, shut the window, and felt as a man feels when a tooth is out and his tongue goes to the place, for the shelf that was no longer there. My hand touched plaster, and it seemed to me that something within the wall behind the square drew a breath that I had drawn often enough and was easy. I have been told that the mantel now adorns a house near the sea, and that its owner has more money than is good for him, and a wife who laughs at nothing. I hope they are both very happy, and that the wind keeps always off-shore. I have left myself only a few lines to say what may still be said of the book. You will remember that I burned my copy. There are other copies. From time to time since these events I have taken up a volume of Caroline de Lichtenfeld in a library or a sale-room, and glanced pour le forme at the early pages. In 2 or 3 I have seen, or thought I saw, upon page 43 some spreading of the ink. In one there was, upon the fly-leaf, a child's exercise in multiplication, and once, in a copy that had belonged to a schoolmistress in Reims, there was written very distinctly in the margin the sentence, "À n'ouvrez pas quand on frappe à la fenêtre." I am sensible that there is nothing here to convince a man who is not persuaded. It is perhaps well so. If every book spoke, there would be no use in other voices. As for the recurrence of the same woman's features, extra tempus, as the schoolmen say, I will offer only what a timid man dares. Those little packets of hair and nail are not a villager's idleness merely. They make, as it were, a circuit between the living and the laid-by, so that what is most constant prints itself upon what is most exposed. A face that has been kept long under pressure will take any image that leans and breathes above it. If a woman has for years set her lip to the flags, with that small shadow upon it which some ladies wear, and asked to be spared in sleep, I do not much wonder if the lip writes itself upon the face beneath. So, the wife's countenance was taken upon the husband's remains. Years of pressed petitions will write a likeness where the face beneath is spread to receive it. And the book. There was no prophecy in it. The unprinted chapter is the readiest to receive a bruise, and paper will take a back impression from ink and intention as surely as plaster from a seal. Thus the names, caught from fly-leaves and prayer-books, and the talk formed in men's minds, long before their tongues are ready, find themselves on page 43, which Montolieu never penned, and the messenger who was seen on the train and again in a photograph may be no more than that steward whom these affairs sometimes employ, wearing the nearest face that will be noticed, and returning it where it was first learned. My figure twice seen of that visitor, once in my room at the inn, and then in my home. The posture, I think, was not theatrical, but ritual. A Friday kneeler's pact, prayers to St. Lou with the other things, hair and nail, the mouth kept to the stone. And when he was gone, the wife, thinking to hold him quiet, kept the practice for both. Now our dear Madame Giraud. She did not, as she had threatened, go to her cousin near Nevers. A year later a letter, misdirected and forwarded to me by the curé, who keeps a better conscience than the post, told me that she had married, in a place of whose name I am not sure, a widower with a son. It is not my habit to moralize, but if there is a providence that keeps a scale for women's acts apart, I hope it will not be curious to measure the exact weight of a hand laid on a little spade, and for that breath beneath, stones, poof, poof. There are persons who will tell you that it is the natural effect of a difference of temperature between the air in an underfloor cavity and the air above, when the sun beats upon a stable roof, or a fire is kindled in a room close by. I will not dispute with a man who is comfortable. I only say that sometimes, in very still weather, when the house is empty and the flies are tired, you may lay your face upon the flags of certain corners, and you will not be able to say afterwards whether the air that went into your mouth was of God's making or another's.